8 men out of every 1,000, every year. That was the death rate for railroad brakemen in America in the 1870s and 1880s. 8 per 1,000, more than double the death rate for coal miners, a job so dangerous that men who survived it were considered lucky to still have all their fingers. Insurance companies refused to write policies on railroad brakemen. The mortality rate was so high, so consistent, so guaranteed, that any company foolish enough to insure them would go bankrupt. So the brakemen formed their own brotherhood. Not for wages, not for rights, not for strikes, but simply to pay the burial costs of the man who died on last Thursday's run. This is the story of the invention that ended that slaughter, and of the 24 years it took to force the railroads to use it. 24 years during which the men who built this country's railroads were chewed up by a system their employers knew how to fix and chose not to. Picture a freight train moving through western Pennsylvania in January of 1873. It is past midnight. The temperature has dropped below zero. The train is running at 30 miles an hour, loaded, heavy, on a long downgrade. Up in the locomotive cab, the engineer feels something wrong with the speed. He reaches for the whistle and blows the signal. 2 short blasts. Down brakes, and somewhere in the darkness behind him, on top of the cars, men start to move. They are brakemen. Their job is to keep that train from becoming a runaway. Each man is assigned 2 or 3 cars. He has to run across the tops of those cars. In the dark in January, locate a vertical iron wheel mounted to the roof and crank it hard enough to bite the brake shoes into the iron wheels below. He has to do this on a moving train. He has to do this on cars with no railings, no safety lines, no lights. He has to do this while the train pitches and sways on uneven track, while the wind at 30 miles per hour tries to knock him flat, while the cars ahead and behind are not the same height, and he has to jump the gaps between them. He has maybe 60 seconds to reach his cars before the engineer needs those brakes working. If he slips, he falls between the cars. If he's slow, the train doesn't stop. If there's a tunnel ahead and he doesn't know about it, the tunnel wall finds him first. But here's the thing the railroads calculated very carefully. It was still cheaper than installing a better system. The better system already existed. It had existed since 1869, when a 22-year-old inventor from Schenectady, New York, walked into every major railroad office in the country and told them he could stop a train with air. They called him Crazy George. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the most powerful railroad man in America, looked at the young inventor and said, "If I understand you, young man, you propose to stop a railroad train with wind. I have no time to listen to such nonsense." The New York Central threw him out. The Erie Railroad threw him out. George Westinghouse walked back into the street and kept working. Who was he? The 8th of 10 children, born in Central Bridge, New York in 1846. His father ran a machine shop in Schenectady, and young George was in that shop from the time he could reach the workbench. He grew up with his hands in gears and boilers and steam valves, learning by touch and trial and failure what every piece of iron could do and couldn't do. He enlisted in the Union Army at 15. He served in the Navy as an acting engineer. He attended college for 3 months and dropped out because books were too slow. He didn't read about machines. He understood them the way some men understand horses. He'd witnessed the aftermath of a head-on train collision. 2 locomotives, 2 sets of brakemen, 2 engineers who saw each other coming and couldn't stop. The braking system didn't fail. It performed exactly as designed. The brakemen ran their rooftops as fast as any human being could run them. The trains still hit each other at combined speed. The design was the problem. And George Westinghouse, who had been building things since childhood, looked at that wreckage and thought, there has to be a better way. He knew about the European mine drillers. They were boring tunnels through the Alps using compressed air. driving rock drills via pipes that ran for hundreds of feet through solid mountain. The pipes worked. The pressure held over distances that would have seemed impossible. If compressed air could transmit enough force to drill through granite via a few hundred feet of iron pipe, why couldn't it transmit braking force along the length of a train? The idea wasn't complicated in principle. Run a pipe the length of the train, put a compressor on the locomotive, let the engineer control every car's brakes from his cab, simultaneously, instantly from a single valve. Simple in concept, savage to execute. The problem wasn't just stopping the train. It was stopping it reliably every time, under every condition. Whether the track was level or dropping steeply, whether the train had 10 cars or 30, whether it was July or the dead of February in the Alleghenies. It had to work when everything was fine, and it had to work when something had already gone wrong. Vanderbilt had said no. The Erie had said no. The New York Central, which had the most to gain from a reliable stopping system, looked at the 22-year-old inventor and his drawings and said no. Westinghouse went around them. An executive of the Panhandle Railroad, a subsidiary of the Pennsylvania, came to him with a grudging offer. They'd let him test his system on one train. But Westinghouse would pay to install it himself, out of his own pocket. And if the brakes failed, he'd pay for every dollar of damage. He was nearly broke. The installation strained him to the limit, cutting every economy he could find. But he got it done. In the fall of 1868, the brake was fitted to a locomotive and 4 cars on the Pittsburgh to Steubenville run. The engineer was a man named Daniel Tate. The Panhandle executives climbed aboard. Westinghouse looked at what he'd built, and then the train moved out. The test didn't go as planned. It went better. The train emerged from the tunnel under Pittsburgh's Grant's Hill, accelerating, picking up speed on the downgrade toward 4th Avenue Station. And there, stopped on the track ahead, was a horse-drawn wagon. The driver had stalled it across the rails and was fighting to clear it. Tate saw it, grabbed the new brake valve, and dumped the air. The train stopped 10 feet from the wagon, 10 feet, from a full-speed passenger train. The executives on board sat in silence for a moment. Then they started talking very fast. The Westinghouse Air Brake Company was incorporated September 28, 1869. Alexander Cassatt, future president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, was among the first investors. The Pennsylvania adopted air brakes across its passenger fleet almost immediately. But the rest of the industry was not the Pennsylvania Railroad, and while the executives debated, and the railroads ran their numbers, and the lawyers argued about conversion costs, the brakemen kept climbing, and the dying kept going, the ghost in every car. The first version of the Westinghouse air brake was elegant in its simplicity. A steam-powered compressor on the locomotive fed air into a main reservoir, from there into a continuous pipe running under every car in the train. The engineer had a valve. Open it, and air pressure flowed to brake cylinders under each car, pushing pistons that drove brake shoes into the wheels. Close it, the air bled out, the brakes released. One man, one lever, every car on the train. It was a revolution over the handbrake. But it had a flaw that could kill everyone aboard. The pipe ran the entire length of the train. It connected to each car through rubber hoses and iron couplings. In 1869, rubber was not what it is now. It cracked in cold, it wore through, couplings leaked, and if the train separated, if a coupling failed and the rear section broke free on a downgrade, the front end of that pipe was now open to atmosphere. Air pressure gone, brakes gone, and the detached cars loaded with freight were now rolling free downhill with nothing between them and whatever was at the bottom. Picture a 30-car freight on a mountain grade in winter. The rear coupling fails at the top of the descent. 20 cars of timber and ore start moving. They have no brakes. They have no crew aboard. The crew is forward on the locomotive. They are 1,000 tons of iron and wood gaining speed on a slope, and they will hit whatever is on the flat below at whatever speed the grade gives them. That was the straight air system's failure mode. Not gradual, not detectable, instant and total the moment the pressure died. The straight air system failed exactly as fast as it lost air pressure. Any break in the pipe anywhere, a cracked hose, a failed coupling, a collision that ruptured the line, left the train entirely without brakes. The system failed in the most dangerous way possible, silently and at the worst moment. Westinghouse went back to the drawing board, and in 1873, 4 years after the first patent, he filed patent 44,006, the automatic air brake with the triple valve. This time, he had understood something profound about failure. The question wasn't how to make the system work. It was how to make the system fail safely. He inverted the logic entirely. In the new system, air pressure didn't apply the brakes, it released them. The brakes were always engaged by default. It took continuous air pressure in the line to hold them off. A compressor on the locomotive kept that pressure up throughout the train. Every car had its own air reservoir, a small tank beneath the frame, charged and ready, and under each car, a device called the triple valve monitored the pressure in the main line. 3 functions, 1 valve. When line pressure was stable, the triple valve kept the brakes released and the car's reservoir charged. When the engineer made a service reduction, a controlled drop in line pressure, the triple valve sensed the change, closed off the reservoir from the line, and opened a port feeding that car's air into the brake cylinder. The piston moved, the brake shoes engaged, on every car, simultaneously, at a signal that traveled the length of the train at 152 meters per second. But here was the part that changed everything. If a hose blew, if a coupling failed, if a car broke loose from the train, the drop in line pressure was catastrophic and immediate. Every triple valve on every car sensed it at once. Every car's brakes slammed on automatically. The train stopped itself. A failed brake pipe didn't mean no brakes. It meant full brakes, everywhere. Simultaneously, this was one of the first large-scale fail-safe systems ever engineered. Whatever went wrong with the system, the result was a stopped train. Could the materials of the 1870s actually hold up? That was the impossible part. The pipe couplings between cars were rubber hoses, hand-fitted, imperfect, exposed to every temperature swing that winter in Pennsylvania could throw at them. Cast iron valves machined to tolerances that 1870s tools could barely maintain. Rubber diaphragms inside the triple valves that had to flex millions of times without cracking. Westinghouse was building a precision pneumatic system out of materials that barely qualified as reliable. He kept modifying it, kept chasing the leaks and the failures. His company in Pittsburgh became a laboratory as much as a factory. They tested, they failed, they tested again. And here, fused into the engineering problem, was the commercial problem. Railroads ran their cars in pools. A car from the Baltimore and Ohio might couple to a car from the Erie at a transfer yard and run west on the Pennsylvania. If those 3 railroads had 3 different air brake designs, none of them would work together. Westinghouse pushed for standardization, not because he was arrogant, but because a patchwork of incompatible designs would kill the whole enterprise. Every car needed to speak the same pneumatic language. The railroads used this against him. They said they needed to wait and see. They said the technology was unproven at scale. What they actually needed was someone to pay for the conversion, and none of them wanted to be first. And every month they waited, men were dying on the rooftops. The demonstration had stopped a train 10 feet from a wagon. The Pennsylvania Railroad had adopted it. But the rest of the industry looked at the conversion cost and looked at the death rate and did arithmetic that would make you sick. Air brakes cost money. Dead brakemen were simply the cost of doing business. There was one thing they hadn't accounted for: What happened when the decision wasn't theirs to make anymore? But that day was still decades away, and between now and then, on the rooftops and in the yards and on the bridges in winter, the men who kept the trains stopping were paying the bill. Rooftop men. You want to know what the brakeman's job actually looked like, day to day? Not in the accident reports, not in the death statistics, in the body of the man who did it. He woke up knowing that by the end of the shift he might not. That's not dramatics. That was the actuarial reality. Life expectancy for a brakeman, according to the Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen's own records, was quite often less than 1 year. Not career expectancy, life expectancy. The men who joined the Brotherhood weren't organizing for better wages. They were organizing because the insurance companies had done the math and refused to insure them, and somebody needed to pay for the funeral. 8 out of every 1,000 died every year. In the 1880s, the only job in America more dangerous was mining coal, and even the coal miners could get insurance. The men who took the brakeman's job were young, mostly. Immigrants who needed work and couldn't be too particular about the conditions. Civil War veterans who'd already survived things that would stop ordinary men cold. Farm boys from Ohio and Indiana who'd come to the cities looking for wages and found the only jobs available were the ones nobody else wanted. They were assessed in the hiring yard not by their references but by their hands. How many fingers did they have? A man with all 10 was green. A man with 8 was experienced. A man with 6 knew what he was doing. The Brotherhood of Railroad Trainmen paid out death benefits of $300 per man. $300. That was the price the industry put on a brakeman's life. Not in wages, not in liability settlements, but in the mutualized grief of his coworkers. His family got $300. The next man got his spot on the car. The missing fingers came from the coupling yards. Before automatic couplers, cars were linked by a system called Lincoln pin. To couple 2 cars, a man stood between them as they rolled together and dropped an iron pin through the link by hand. If he was fast enough, the pin went through clean and the cars coupled. If he was slow, or if the engineer misjudged the approach speed, the cars came together while his hand was still in the gap. There are railroad accident reports from the 1880s that read like casualty lists from a small war, a single line per man, name, date, location, what the train did to him, finger crushed, coupling cars, fell from moving train and killed, arm cut off, walking beside moving train. The reports run for pages. Coupling was the day shift's horror. The night shift had its own. The down brake's whistle came without warning. 2 short blasts, sometimes in the middle of a curve, sometimes in a blizzard, sometimes at 2 in the morning when a man had been sitting in an unheated caboose for 6 hours and his hands were barely working. He had to be moving before the second blast faded. Out of the caboose and up the ladder onto the car roof, cast iron rungs, coated with ice or oil or both, and then running, not walking, running. The cars were not the same height. The gaps between them were not the same width. The tops were curved to shed rain and had no walkways, no rails, no lights except whatever the moon or a distant station signal threw across the dark. He was running on top of a moving train at 30 miles an hour in January in the dark. If the train was on a curve, the cars shifted laterally, and the gaps between them opened and closed with each sway. If there was a bridge ahead, the crossbeams were at head height. Men didn't always know where the bridges were. In winter, the brakemen's cabins were unheated. The communication with the engineer required them to be partially open to the elements, which meant any sustained cold spell could leave a man hypothermic before he ever got the signal. Brakemen froze. Not as a figure of speech, they physically froze. Stiff and unresponsive, unable to turn the brake wheel, unable to reach their cars. Dead men still sitting at their posts, and the train, without braking, continued. A stuck brake wheel could betray you too. You leaned into it with your full weight. It broke free suddenly, and the momentum threw you sideways off the car. You were gone before anyone knew you'd fallen. The train behind you didn't stop. The wheels didn't stop. In the dark, in a blizzard, nobody heard anything. How long could a man last up there in January? Some didn't make it to the first stop. The engineers knew what they were asking. Some of them hated it. Some had been brakemen themselves once and still carried the nightmares. But the whistle was all they had. The handbrake was all there was. You blew the signal, you hoped your men were fast and sure-footed and lucky, and you hoped whatever was ahead of you on the track was far enough away that luck and speed would be enough. Sometimes it wasn't far enough, and sometimes it was worse than that. Sometimes what was ahead on the track was the wreckage of another train, already burning, and 60 seconds was never going to be enough, no matter how fast those men ran. Because what was coming, what the railroads knew was coming, and kept choosing to ignore, was not a single disaster. It was a staircase, each step higher than the last, each one built on the same foundation, men who had no way to stop a train fast enough, and a solution that sat unused on a shelf. The night at Wappinger Creek, December 18, 1867, Angola, New York, 2 years before Westinghouse filed his patent. The New York Express was running east toward Buffalo when the last car derailed crossing a trestle bridge over Big Sister Creek. The car plunged 30 feet into the gorge below. The pot-bellied heating stove inside broke loose on impact and scattered live coals across the floor. The kerosene lamps shattered. The wooden car was dry as kindling. It was fully engulfed within seconds, with people still inside. The second car came down right behind it. Both cars were burning in the creek bed. Farmers from the surrounding land ran to help. One of them, a man named Josiah Southwick, got close enough to feel the heat on his face, close enough to hear the screaming from inside the wreckage, and then the flames drove him back. He couldn't get to them. Nobody could get to them. 49 people died in the Angola horror, most of them burned alive in a wooden car at the bottom of a frozen creek. It was one of the deadliest railroad disasters in American history, and George Westinghouse was 21 years old, working in Schenectady, and the air brake didn't exist yet. Angola wasn't a preventable disaster in 1867. There was no solution yet to prevent it with. But the country had seen what uncontrollable trains did to people, and it demanded answers. And 2 years later, the answer existed. It just took the industry 22 more years to accept it. February 6, 1871. The Hudson River Valley in New York State. Temperature below zero. Ice on the rails. Ice on the creek below the trestle bridge at New Hamburg. The Westinghouse air brake has now been proven for 2 years. The Pennsylvania Railroad is already running it on passenger trains. And none of that matters tonight. 2 trains are moving through the same valley on the same line in opposite directions. The southbound freight train is a long consist, 25 cars, including tank cars loaded with oil. As it approaches the bridge over Wappinger Creek, something snaps. A broken axle. Cars jackknife. The oil tank cars lurch sideways across both tracks over the bridge railing. The crew fights to stop. They get signal lanterns out, but the night is dark and cold, and there are only seconds, and the passenger train coming from the other direction is already close. The New York Central's Pacific Express, pride of the line. 7 cars, sleeping cars, a baggage car, passengers bound for Buffalo and points west, many of them already in their berths. The engineer, a man named Doc Simmons, comes around the bend south of Poughkeepsie and sees the lanterns. He sees the wreckage across the track and the bridge ahead. He blows the signal, 2 hard blasts, and fights the throttle whilst somewhere behind him in the dark, his brakemen are waking up, pulling on coats, scrambling toward the ladders. They climbed in the dark. They ran in the dark. The cars were moving under them, and the night was below zero, and the bridge ahead was already occupied by wreckage. They turned the brake wheels as fast as their hands could work. It wasn't fast enough. It couldn't be fast enough. The weight of a full passenger train at speed doesn't yield to human hands in 60 seconds. The physics were not negotiable. The Pacific Express hit the derailed freight at enough speed to drive Doc Simmons and his locomotive off the bridge and into the ice-covered creek. The baggage car followed. The sleeping cars piled into the wreckage. The oil from the tank cars ignited. The bridge was burning. The sleeping cars were burning. People who had been asleep 2 minutes ago were trapped in burning wreckage on a collapsing bridge over a frozen creek in the middle of the night. 22 people died, including Simmons, including a brakeman named Lawrence Mooney. The Westinghouse brake had been demonstrated for 2 years. The Pennsylvania Railroad was running it. What happened at Wappinger Creek did not have to happen. The railroads knew. They had chosen not to pay for the conversion. Harper's Weekly ran 3 full-page illustrations the following month. The burning car, the scene the next morning, the recovery of the bodies. One of the most shocking disasters on record, they called it. But shocking and instructive are different things. The railroads absorbed the public outrage, waited for it to fade, and kept running their brakemen across the rooftops, because the math still said wait. Then came December 29, 1876, Ashtabula, Ohio. Blizzard conditions, near dark, the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern Railway's Pacific Express crossing an iron truss bridge over the Ashtabula River. The bridge had been designed by the railroad company's own president and inadequately inspected by its chief engineer. At 7:30 in the evening, with 159 people aboard, the bridge fractured. The train fell 70 feet. All but the lead locomotive went into the river. 11 cars, passenger cars, sleeping cars, baggage cars, piled into the ravine at the bottom of a blizzard in Ohio in December. The coal stoves and kerosene lamps inside those wooden cars did what they always did on impact. The wreckage caught fire, and the survivors who had lived through the fall, people with broken legs, broken arms, people pinned under collapsed car frames, found themselves inside burning wreckage in a frozen river, unable to move, unable to get out, while the fire closed in around them. The rescue attempt was feeble. The town of Ashtabula was small. The storm was brutal. Firefighters couldn't reach the bottom of the ravine. People who had survived the fall burned to death while men stood at the rim and watched, unable to get to them. Of 159 people aboard, 92 died. 92. The railroad set up a makeshift morgue in the freight house. Families came from as far as Maine and California to identify what remained. 19 bodies couldn't be identified at all. The railroad bought a plot in the local cemetery for those 19 and buried them there, names unknown. The railroad's chief engineer testified before the state legislature and then committed suicide. The Westinghouse air brake had been available for 7 years. Here is a number from the Federal Register that should stop you cold. In the 8 years before Congress finally passed the Safety Appliance Act in 1893, the number of railroad workers killed or injured was equal to the total number of people employed by the entire railroad industry in a single year. The industry killed its own workforce and replaced it, and kept running. The public demanded action after Ashtabula. Congress began moving. Between 1890 and 1892, 17 bills were introduced to mandate safety equipment on American railroads. 17. Introduced, debated, amended, delayed. The railroads lobbied against every one of them. They argued the technology was still developing. They argued federal mandates would stifle innovation. They argued the market would sort it out. The market had been sorting it out for 24 years, and the sorting produced body counts that ran to the thousands. The Safety Appliance Act of 1893 made air brakes mandatory on every locomotive and every train in the United States engaged in interstate commerce. 7-year grace period, full effect by 1900. The law was clear. You will use the Westinghouse brake. You will stop running brakemen across the rooftops. You will stop treating the bodies of working men as an acceptable operating expense. 24 years after a 22-year-old called Crazy George walked out of Vanderbilt's office and kept working. And here is what that looked like the first time someone saw it work on a train that wasn't supposed to stop in time. A Pennsylvania railroad engineer, sometime in the years after the act, with a full passenger consist and an obstruction materializing around a curve, he reached for the brake valve and dumped the air. Every triple valve on every car in his train fired simultaneously. The signal traveled faster than sound. The train stopped. The passengers felt the lurch and held onto their armrests and complained about the jolt. They did not burn. They did not go into a river. They did not have to be identified by the clothes on their backs. That was what the brake did. That was what it had always been capable of doing. Since 1869, St. George, the numbers came in over the following decade. Not estimates, not projections, hard numbers from railroads now required to keep records, compiled by the Interstate Commerce Commission and reported in trade publications that the industry couldn't ignore. From 1893 to 1908, trainmen deaths and injuries fell by 1/3, not despite the expansion of the railroads, in spite of it. In those 15 years, the number of men employed on American railroads grew by 43%. More workers, more trains, more track, more exposure, and still the death rate dropped by 1/3. Braking-related deaths specifically fell by 38%. The Railway Gazette published the figures in March of 1910, and they were unambiguous. The air brake had done exactly what Westinghouse said it would do in 1869. It had just taken the country 24 years and tens of thousands of dead and maimed working men to believe him. But the brake's legacy was larger than the safety numbers. Those numbers measure what stopped happening. The brake also determined what became possible. Before air brakes, the practical limit for a freight train's length was roughly 10 cars. More than that, and the handbrake system became so slow and unmanageable that stopping the train was a genuine gamble. 10 cars set a hard ceiling on how much any single locomotive could move on a single run. It constrained everything: freight rates, delivery times, the economics of long-haul shipping, the viability of the Western rail lines. Westinghouse's brake removed that ceiling. With a reliable, simultaneous braking system, trains could run 50 cars, 100 cars. Longer trains meant lower costs per ton-mile. Lower costs reshaped the economics of the entire continent. The grain that fed the East Coast cities, the coal that fired the steel mills, the steel that built the bridges, the lumber that raised the cities of the Pacific Northwest. All of it moved by freight trains that could only grow to the length they grew because of what was underneath every car: a small iron valve, an air reservoir, and a rubber hose running to the next car in line. The triple valve principle that Westinghouse patented in 1873 is still the operating principle of freight train braking in the United States today. The compressor has changed, the materials have changed. The tolerances are tighter, the rubber better, the metallurgy refined 100 times over. But the logic, fail-safe, pressure released, automatically applied on any brake in the line, is Westinghouse's logic. Every freight train in America is stopped by a system built on his understanding of how failure ought to behave. The Westinghouse Air Brake Company ran for 130 years. In 1999, it merged with Motive Power Industries to form Wabtec Corporation, which still manufactures braking and train control systems for rail networks around the world. The name Westinghouse has faded from the corporate nameplate, but the principle persists in every brake cylinder on every car from here to Los Angeles. The superintendent of a small Pennsylvania railroad, writing in the years after the Safety Appliance Act, put it plainly. If the men who work the railroads ever choose a patron saint, it will be St. George in honor of George Westinghouse. St. George, the dragon slayer, the patron of those who stand between the vulnerable and what would destroy them. It's a heavy title for an engineer from Schenectady, New York. But the superintendent was right about one thing. Westinghouse fought something monstrous. The dragon wasn't mechanical. It wasn't the flawed brake or the unruly physics of heavy iron on a downgrade. The dragon was the indifference of powerful men to the deaths of working ones. The calculation that said, brakeman dying is cheaper than fixing the problem. The 24 years of that calculation running undisturbed, while men fell off rooftops in January and burned alive in sleeping cars and got crushed in coupling yards, while the solution sat waiting in Pittsburgh, proven, available, and ignored. Westinghouse didn't just invent a brake. He invented it at 22, got laughed out of the offices of every great railroad man in America, staked his own money on a test he couldn't afford to fail, and then spent 2 decades building the infrastructure, technical, commercial, standardized, that made the brake universal. He was pushed out of his own company for a period. He fought Edison in the war of currents and won, and in winning gave the world the AC electrical grid that still powers everything you plug in today. He died in 1914 at 67 at his home in New York. He had over 300 patents. He had built an empire. But the air brake was the thing that proved the argument, that an engineering solution, stubbornly and correctly applied, can break the back of an institutional indifference that money alone could not move. The railroads weren't moved by compassion. They were moved by law, and the law was possible because Westinghouse had proved in a Pittsburgh rail yard, with a borrowed locomotive and a near-broke inventor's last resources, that the thing could be done. Think about what the Brakemen's brotherhood became after 1900. The rooftop runs ended. The scramble in the dark ended. The men who had been hired specifically because their lives were considered expendable found that their lives were now, by federal law, worth more than the conversion cost. The brotherhood redirected itself, from paying burial benefits to advocating for wages and working conditions that hadn't been possible to argue for when the base question was whether you'd survive the next run. It's a philosophy as much as an engineering principle. Design for failure, assume the worst, make the default state safe. When Westinghouse inverted the logic of his straight-air system in 1873, when he decided that air would release the brakes rather than apply them, he was making a statement about how complex systems ought to be built, not optimized for the best case, designed around the worst one. The railroads had done the opposite. They had designed for the best case, an attentive brakeman, good weather, clear track, nothing unexpected. They had ignored the worst case, because the worst case cost money to address, and the men who died in the worst case were not the men making the decisions. Westinghouse came from a different tradition. His father's machine shop in Schenectady had taught him that machines break. The Civil War had taught him that conditions are never ideal, and the wreckage he'd walked past at the head-on collision in his early years had taught him that the gap between usually works and always works is where men get killed. The men who ran the rooftops are mostly unnamed now. There are fragments. Lawrence Mooney killed at Wappinger Creek. Josiah Southwick on the bank at Angola, stopped by the heat, listening to the screaming from inside a burning car he could not reach. The thousands of others whose names appear briefly in railroad accident reports, and then are gone, their lives reduced to a single line in the Brotherhood's death benefit ledger. $300, payable to next of kin. They were the cost of 24 years of corporate indifference, and they were real people, and they deserved better than they got. They got it, in the end. late and hard fought and bought with more bodies than it should have cost. But they got it, a small iron valve under every car, an air reservoir, a triple valve logic that says when pressure fails, the brakes hold. When the system breaks down, the train stops. They don't make them like that anymore. The men, or the stubbornness, or the refusal to be told that we couldn't stop a train. Progress has a price. For the brakeman, it was paid in full, long before the bill was finally settled.